We're going to be following nutrient cycling for the next 3 lectures, and we're going to be basically talking about 4 of the nutrients, 4 essential nutrients. We're going to be talking about nitrogen, phosphorus, sulfur, and potassium. And I talk about them because they all, basically from nitrogen to sulfur, you're basically, nitrogen to potassium, you're looking at the sort of the spectrum of how nutrients behave in the soil. And there are good sort of examples of all the variability that you might see in a soil as to how those nutrients behave. So, but in a sense, essentially why we're talking about this though is this why are nutrients so essential? Okay, well, or why are we talking about it? Well, they're so essential for life. And in a sense, its availability or lack thereof, or the nutrients availability or lack thereof, basically controls the distribution of flora and fauna. Now, that makes sense, but why are we talking about it in a soils course? Well, with very few exceptions, soils control nutrient uptakes into plants, nutrient uptake into plants. Now, there are 2 exceptions to that, and in a sense, I mean, there's components of it that are controlled by the soil and components that are not, but the 2 exceptions are nitrogen and carbon. Okay, obviously, when you think about carbon and you start thinking about photosynthesis, carbon's coming into the plants from CO2. It's through photosynthesis. It's not a soil-borne CO2. Though the CO2, part of that flux comes from the soil, as well as for us. We're not in the soil. But so one nutrient, so carbon, well, we're going to talk about that as a nutrient cycle. Carbon is not necessarily controlled by the soil. And the other one is nitrogen. And nitrogen, for most plants, nitrogen availability is controlled by the soil. But there is also nitrogen fixation. And so in a sense, plant uptake of nitrogen is not necessarily controlled by the soil for all plants. But for most plants, that is in fact the case. Okay? Now, we're going to be talking about nitrogen today. And if we start talking about nitrogen, as with all nutrients, we really need to start thinking about what are we talking about. The availability of those nutrients are basically controlled by 3 things. Okay? It is the sources of that nutrient, which we would call a pool, the sink, where that material goes, that nutrient goes, which is also a pool, and the fluxes between those pools. Okay? What are controlling those pools and what's controlling the movement of nutrients between those pools? Okay? Now, I'm premising this lecture and all the lectures that are following on the basis of, we're looking at nutrient use by organisms, okay? And you need to understand that organisms need to get their nutrients in certain forms, very specific forms, okay? So in a sense, you could say to each its own form of nutrient, okay? Now, today we're going to be talking about the nitrogen cycle, and let me take a step back. This is the nitrogen cycle. I want to take a step back. This is the slide that we ended the last lecture with. Okay, and this is, in a sense, this is a sort of a cycle slide. Okay, and we were talking about the soil solution, and we're talking about pH and cation exchange capacity, and how these different bases and acids and aluminum are sort of controlled by the soil environment into this soil solution, right? Okay, well, what we're going to be talking about over the next couple days is sort of a modification of what's going on here. Okay, what in fact are controlling these variety of pools and what are controlling these fluxes? And how is that being controlled by the soil? Okay, so today we're going to be talking about the nitrogen cycle. Okay, before we actually start talking about this, I want to take a few moments and I want to talk about nutrient cycling or cycles in general. And to do that, we're going to talk about carbon, okay? Because I think most of us are fairly familiar with the carbon cycle. And so let's talk about this idea of what the pools are and what the fluxes are, okay? So with carbon, perhaps the best way we should start is we should start with the pool of CO2, okay? This is the atmosphere, okay? It's a large pool. Not compared to nitrogen, it's rather small, but it's a large pool of carbon, okay? What happens to this pool? Well, for plants, with the use of sunlight, we take that CO2 and we photosynthesize it, right? So it goes into a plant, okay? And it goes into some organic form, okay? The pool is this. this is the flux, right? So we now have two pools, the CO2 that's in the atmosphere. We have the flux of that CO2 into the plant, and the plant is now a new pool of carbon. Now, sooner or later, this carbon's going to die, and it's going to be turned into a food stock, in essence, okay? And it's going to be taken up by organisms, okay? Now, how you get from here to here, there's a lot of different ways that you do that. I mean, this could be direct grazing, a cow coming up and basically eating grass. Or this could be leaf fall, where it goes into an organic pool on the soil, where it then gets grazed by microorganisms and fungi and worms and everything like that, okay? And this basically gets, you guys remember that this is a mobilization. There's a mineralization and a mobilization again. They're turning it into biomass, okay? And this organic matter is now biomass. Not tree biomass, but organisms like us, okay? So here's the flux, here's the pool. In the process, we have CO2 volatilizing off, basically going back into this pool up here. So we have a variety of different fluxes. This, in turn, as with this, is going to get decomposed, and sooner or later, it's going to go back into the CO2 in the atmosphere. Now, depending upon decomposition, we talked about decomposition of organic matter, these and this can also go into another pool, which we call SOM, soil organic matter, which in turn can be eaten, and it too can go up to CO2. In essence, does that make sense? All right, so we have a number of different pools, and we have a number of different fluxes. Okay? The pools and the fluxes are controlled by different adaphic factors, factors that are native to this environment. Okay? Certainly you can imagine if I have an anaerobic system, I have a wet system, I have different types of organic material, I have different kinds of organic organisms that are doing the decomposition, these pools and fluxes are going to be modified. But in essence, this is the carbon cycle that we all talk about. Question? Mineralization is the conversion of an organic form to an inorganic form. Immobilization is the conversion of an inorganic form to an organic form. Okay? Probably the best way to imagine that is I'm turning it into biomass. Okay? No. Question? You got that? Did that make sense?
How does that relate to the function? What's going on there?
This is immobilization. This is mineralization. Okay, I'm taking it from this biomass and turning it into CO2. I'm taking it from an organic form and turning it into an inorganic form. That is mineralization. When I take it from an inorganic form and I turn it into an organic form, that's a mobilization. Does that make sense to everybody?
Which arrow exactly is mineralization?
This is mineralization.
But it's not going directly to the air.
No, it's going through CO2.
So that whole thing.
So these arrows here are all mineralization. This arrow here is immobilization. This is an extension of that of the immobilization. Because the plant material has already immobilized it, but it's being eaten. Okay? Part of that stays in biomass, and part of that goes up to become CO2. Does that make sense to everybody? Yeah? Now we could talk about methane and all the other byproducts, but this is a very simple sort of this flux cycle. Go.
So just to clarify, the biomass from CH2, the biomass that would be immobilized into biomass?
Got it? Okay? Inorganic, organic. Arrow going this way, immobilization. No, arrow going this way, immobilization. Arrow going this way, mineralization. Right? A lot of different processes that drive this, respiration, decomposition. But anything that's going to take it from an organic form and put it into CO2, the inorganic form, is mineralization. I'm turning it into a mineral. Right? We don't have any silicon-based life forms unless you're looking at Star Trek at this point. Right? Okay? Cool? Yeah? All right. So let's start talking about this cycle. This is the nitrogen cycle. And this slide is rather complex. Okay? We're going to break this slide down and I'm going to simplify it. Okay? But in essence, this is the nitrogen cycle. Every one of the boxes basically is a pool. Every one of the arrows is basically a flux. Okay? The direction of the arrow indicates what direction the flux is going. Okay? From what pool it's moving into. From where it's coming and where it's going. Okay? Now, if we look at something like that, we have a couple questions that we need to think about. The first question is, what are the pools? What are the specific pools? Okay? And where are the sources and losses in those pools? Also, what are the fluxes between the pools? Which will sort of direct these issues of sources and losses. Okay? Now, when you think about these controls, the flux rates and the pools are often controlled by adaphic factors, the factors that are happening at that location. But the end sources are often global in nature. Okay? Like the CO2 here, this CO2, the flux rates and the pools that we're seeing here are very local. But that CO2 is very global in nature. That's the atmosphere. Okay? Well, that's the case with all of these nutrients. All right, so if we're talking about global, let's actually talk about where these pools are. Okay? This is not from your book. I pulled this from a nutrient book. Okay? But basically, this tells the inventory of nitrogen in our four spheres. Okay? The biosphere, the lithosphere, the hydrosphere, and the atmosphere. Okay? The largest pool, if you're talking about nitrogen, the largest pool is in the lithosphere, in the rocks. Okay? The core of the earth, the sediment, the coal, seabed materials. Okay? Very small pools. Then you actually look at the terrestrial soil component, very small pool. The second largest pool behind the lithosphere is the atmosphere. Okay? Nitrogen gas in the atmosphere. We also have the hydrosphere, fairly small pools, and then we have the biosphere. That's us. Very small pool. Most of the nitrogen on our planetary system is in the rocks. The second largest pool is in the atmosphere. Okay? So that tells us where it is. But we're more concerned about what's going on locally. So where in the biosphere and the sort of in us and in the soil N, where is that nitrogen coming from and where it's going? Okay? Now this is the nitrogen cycle that was in your book. Okay? You notice that it's getting a little bit simpler. Okay? Again, all these boxes are the pools. The arrows are the fluxes. So what are the sources into the pedosphere? There's basically 5 sources. The first is biological nitrogen fixation. Fixation of nitrogen by biological organisms, N2, into an organic form, ultimately into NH2, the amine form. We also have fertilizer. Now this could be industrial nitrogen fixation where we're intentionally doing this for fertilizer, but it also can be emissions. And I'm going to talk about these two a little bit in a few slides. And the reason I'm going to talk about these two is that these two are primarily the ones that we have somewhat of a control over. Now, we also have lightning. Actually, the bolt of lightning will react in the atmosphere and basically create a natural source of nitrogen that it's usable for in the soils in the pedosphere. Okay? And that basically accounts for about 5% of all natural sources. We also have off-site organic matter additions, i.e. organic matter is in one location and the wind blows and it takes that organic matter and moves it to another location. Well, the nitrogen that's in that organic matter is going to be moving from the first location to the second location. And then we also have the issue of dust. Nitrogen actually literally moving in dust, much like off-site organic matter additions. Okay? Let's talk about a little bit about these two, just to give you somewhat of a perspective. If we start looking at what type of organisms, where this nitrogen is coming from, there is a number of different organisms that have the ability to take nitrogen gas and convert it into biomass. Okay? Now, nitrogen gas, N2, is nitrogen gas. Okay? Now, interestingly, it's a triple bond. There are 3 bonds holding those things together. Now, for organisms to use nitrogen, we need to have it in this form, an amine form. Okay, now this is going to be attached to a larger organic molecule. Okay, but we only need one of these. But this is triple bonded. This is really well bonded together. It's a tight bond. For organisms to break that bond, it takes a lot of energy. Now think about this. If I'm an organism and I have nitrogen in another form that's available for me to use, that's all around me, would I prefer to break this nitrogen, which is going to take a lot of energy to do, or would I rather take the easily available nitrogen that's in another form than this? Yes, it's in another form than this, but I can take it up and I can assimilate it. I'm going to go with the easy route. So it turns out that this ability to convert this to this has a sort of a select environmental control. This is a huge, if you can do this, this is a huge advantage. But it's only a huge advantage when other forms of nitrogen are not available. Does that make sense? So as a result, I don't know if this is actually the result, but it turns out there are very few species of organisms compared to the large pool of organisms that are on the planet that actually can do this, that can do the nitrogen fixation. Now, some of these are free living. Some of these live in symbiotic relationships with other organisms. Okay? Some of them, this is the whole sort, not all of them, but this is a huge slew of these different type of organisms. And it basically gives you an idea about how much nitrogen, N2, they're fixing, or kilograms per hectare. So in some cases, it's rather small. In some cases, it's rather large. Okay, make sense? Just to give you an idea what this distribution is. The other big source of nitrogen is fertilizer. Okay? I threw this in here basically to give you an idea about how, this is basically the green revolution, but it gave you an idea about how much more fertilizer or the increased use of fertilizer we've seen over the last few decades. Okay? Basically, sometime in the middle 1960s, we started having the green revolution, which was basically agriculture through fertilizer or through chemistry. Basically, we saw a lot of nitrogen fixation going on from an industrial sense. This nitrogen was then fixed and started to be used. Okay? Now, this is a slide right here where you can see a series of crops. You can see the green crops back up here versus they're green too, but lighter green. This is a direct response of nitrogen fertilizer. More nitrogen fertilizer was applied here, less here, and as a response, we had greener crops, more productive crops. Okay? Now, it doesn't say how. In this case, we're talking about an artificial fertilizer that's put in, an industrial fertilizer. But in general, when you see more nitrogen in the system, no matter what the source is, you're going to have a greener crop, more productive crop. Okay? And you can see that response. This is nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Okay? This is the green revolution. Okay, questions? Go. If these are symbiotic relationships, some of these are symbiotic, some of these are free living organisms. And it's not just legumes, but there are a number of other types of plants that are out there that have these symbiotic relationships. It's a microbial population that's doing the nitrogen fixation. The plants themselves are not. The microbial population is, and the microbes are supplying nitrogen to the plants, and the plants in turn are supplying carbon energies to the microorganisms.
So then this is how much of those organisms these legumes can support?
This is a list of the type of legumes: soybeans, cow beans, clover, alfalfa, lupins. And this is the amount of nitrogen that these guys range from fixing in this symbiotic relationship. Sorry, thank you for. We feel good with this? Do we feel good with this? No? Yes? Okay. Now, this is intentional fertilizer use. But we also have unintentional fertilizer use. This is emissions, in essence. Now, you've seen this slide before, but you've seen it in a different form. When I was talking about acidification and I was talking about acid rain, you had a slide that looked basically like this. Now, I'm talking about emissions. This is an emission slide. Where's it coming from? It's coming from the same stacks that are throwing up the acid rain. The stacks are basically burning coal, and in that coal is sulfur and nitrogen. Okay? In this example, we're looking at nitrogen. Okay? But that nitrogen goes up into the atmosphere, and it mixes with water, and it basically makes nitric acid. Okay? That water comes down as rain, and we acidify these environments. But it's a nitric acid, which means it's nitrogen coming down. So at the same time as we're acidifying these environments, we're basically fertilizing them. And this is a map of that fertility. Basically, we're looking at the Ohio Valley and the power plants that are sitting up in here, the wind pushing things this way, and we're seeing the downwind response of that nitrogen hitting the ground. Yes, we're acidifying, but we're also nitrifying. We're fertilizing and acidifying at the same time. We're fertilizing the world, but this is a good example of that pattern. Okay? And we control this. Okay? Questions?
So the concentration of emissions in this like kind of central to northeastern America is caused by like
Power plants.
density?
Power plants.
Power plant.
Coal-fired power plants are the major driver of this. Now, it's not that we're not going to have emissions all other places, but this is where the concentration, I mean, this was where the industrial base of the country was. This is where they needed the power. All right. So back to the nitrogen cycle. We've got to understand, we've got three questions that we're thinking about. What are the pools? What are the sources and losses? And what are the fluxes? And then we need to think about what those controls are on these three components, the pools and the fluxes. Okay, so what are the fluxes? You'll notice that the nitrogen cycle slide is getting simpler and simpler. Okay, what I'm trying to do is get it smaller and smaller, and more and more adaphic, more and more local. Okay, and so what we're going to do is we're going to go to this slide right here. This is a comic book slide. Okay, very simple, but I want to simplify this as much as possible so that I can then bring it back up. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to look at this cycle and we're going to look at the variety of different pools, and there's basically 3 or 4 pools in here that are sort of the anchor points. One is the plants themselves. Another one is the organic material that's in the soil. Okay? The material that is coming from the plants as well as other organisms. Okay? We're looking at a lot of different fluxes here and a series of pool stages here. And then the third really large one is the atmosphere. Okay? Now, what we're going to do is we're going to break this thing up, and all these yellow, everything that you see that is highlighted is basically a flux, or it's the name of that flux. Okay? And what we're going to do is we're going to start right here, and we're going to look at this section first, then we're going to look at this section right here, and then we're going to look at this section. All right? So let's start with that first one, which is the organic material moving to the nitrate form. Basically, we're looking at mineralization. Okay, so we start with the organic form, okay, and it is an amino N, which is this one right here. We're looking at this amino N. Okay, so we're following this nitrogen right here. Okay, so here's the R, here's the rest of the carbon structure, here's the nitrogen from the amine. Okay, this is decomposed. Okay, and in the process of decomposition, we're basically making ammonium. Okay, I'm taking it from organic form to an inorganic form. This is then converted with energy into a nitrite. And in turn, this nitrite is turned into nitrate. Okay? This mineralization basically has two components. With the first component is this section right here. Okay? We call that ammonification. Basically, the conversion of the amine into ammonium. Okay? The second part of this is we call nitrification, basically the conversion of that ammonium into the nitrate. This component right here, from here to here. Now, both of these, the ammonium and the nitrate, are in forms that can be assimilated by organisms. Okay? This material can be taken up by plants, and in the process of decomposition, it can be assimilated by the microorganisms that are doing the decomposition. Okay? Once it gets back into that biomass form, sooner or later it's going to die, and it will come right back to this organic residue. Does that make sense to everybody? Go.
How well are we going to have to know these formulas?
The formulas, I expect you guys to know these cycles. Okay? But more importantly, I expect you to know what the controls are. So let's actually talk about these two forms. This is in biomass. The ammonium is literally a gas. Okay? And if it's a gas, it's going to start moving up through the air, through the soil column. And if it gets captured by the roots, it will be taken to the plant, but this ammonium can escape and go up into the atmosphere. So there is a potential loss of this ammonium. Okay? This nitrite down here, this is not a gas, but it is soluble in water. Where that water moves, that nitrate is going. Now, if that water moves towards the plants, this theoretically can be taken up by the plants. This is in a form that the plants can use. If that water doesn't go near the plants and the plants aren't pumping it, this in the water can be leached from the system. So this can be lost from the system as well. So both of these forms are potentially lost, and it turns out that this form too can be potentially lost. What?
That one is also soluble.
That's soluble as well. Question?
Is this a mineralization or is this a mobilization?
This, from here to here, is mineralization. We're taking it from an organic form to an inorganic form.
So plants need the inorganic form?
Plants are taking it up as an inorganic form. Plants cannot take up the organic form. We can take up the organic form. We call it eating. Okay, the microbial population are eating it. We can do this. Plants can't. Plants can take it from here and take it in. We can't. We need to take it as an organic material. Okay? Does that make sense to everybody? Now, what I'd like to do is break this part up just for a second. We're starting with the ammonium in this case. We're starting here. We're just looking at this highlighted zone. Okay? And you'll note that this is a two-step process. This ammonium goes to a nitrite. From nitrite, it goes to nitrate. It turns out that this is mediated by two different microbial populations. The first population is called Nitrosamonis. Okay? It's basically taking that ammonium with oxygen, basically turning it into nitrate. Uses a lot of energy to do that. The interesting thing here is that this is toxic. If this builds up to high levels, it will actually kill the organism that's doing it. Anybody ever heard of nitrites before? If you eat cold cuts or things like that, you should know what nitrites are. We use it as a preservative because it's basically, in essence, it's basically a toxin. Okay? It kills the organisms that are going to do the decomposition. Now, interestingly enough, this toxic molecule, this toxic material, is then taken by Nitrobacter and converted into nitrate. So nitrite, that's a typo. That should be nitrate. Okay? Now, if this builds up, this is a paired reaction. This has to happen at the same time. Because if this builds up to too high a concentration, it's killing the organisms that are doing the conversion. Okay? So the Nitrosamonis and the Nitrobacter have to be operating at the same time for this cycle to go through. Okay? Cool? All right. Interesting, again, these guys are all in a soluble form. They're soluble in water. Now, the other interesting thing is here is this clay. See, I have this highlighted as fixed. This is a positively charged ion, which means it can interact with the cation exchange sites, the CEC. Yes, it's a gas and it'll start moving through the system, but it can react with the cation exchange sites and be held like a base, because it is a base. It's a base cation in essence. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay, so this can go this way. This could also go in here. It could be assimilated by microorganisms, and it can also be taken up by plants. This one form. This form can be taken up by plants. It can be assimilated by microorganisms, and it also can be leached from the system. And it also can be taken up through denitrification into the next step of the nitrogen cycle, basically from nitrate to N2 gas. This component right here. And let's expand on that. This unit right here, basically what we're looking at is we're looking at the nitrate. It's being converted into nitric oxide and finally into nitrogen gas, nitrogen gas. Okay? Now, this is also microbially mediated. In the first scenario here, we're basically looking at energy and nitrogen. They're trying to get nitrogen. In this form, this isn't about nitrogen. This is actually more about respiration. Remember, this is soluble, which means it's in the water. Okay, if it's in the water, it's moving with the water, that means that there's probably limitations on oxygen. This is moving in anaerobic systems. Interestingly enough, we have all those microorganisms that can use anaerobic respiration. And what they do is they take this, and through anaerobic respiration, basically they convert it up to this. This part of the reaction is driven by the lack of oxygen. If there is oxygen in this system, this will not happen. Does that make sense? Let's say that again. Okay? If there's oxygen in this system, this reaction is greatly limited because it's not to the benefit of the organisms that are there. There's a population of organisms that are aerobic. They're going to use oxygen. This is done without oxygen. This is anaerobic respiration. Okay? Questions? You feel comfortable with that? Okay. And these are gases. These are the gases that we have in the atmosphere. Nitrogen gas. We're right back to that N2 over there. Now, I throw this slide in here so that we can sort of throw together this whole component of the nitrogen cycle. Okay, here's nitrification, here's ammonification, here's denitrification. Okay, so ammonification is this conversion to this. Okay? Nitrification is this conversion to this. Denitrification is this conversion to this. Okay, so this is ammonification, this is nitrification, this is denitrification. Right? Now, let's explain this graph. This is the percentage of maximum microbial activity. Okay, so this is a measurement of the organisms that are doing nitrification, ammonification, and denitrification. This along the bottom is the percent of the soil pores that are filled with water. The more you're filled with water, the less oxygen you have. Make sense? So we're going from an aerobic system to an anaerobic system. Now, in a completely dry situation, we're getting nothing microbially. There's no microbial activity. They need to have some water. Okay? As the water increases, we start seeing an increase in ammonification and denitrification. Now, the assumption here is that I have organic matter for these microbes to decompose. As I start seeing more and more water in the system, my ammonification, the first step, and my nitrification, the second step, increase until I get some range around 60 to 70% pore-filled spaces, water-filled pores. Now, as the water level increases, denitrification and ammonification start dropping off. Okay, what is that an indicator of? What does that tell you about the organisms that are doing it? They're aerobic. They need to have oxygen, right? But you'll note that someplace around here we start seeing the increase in denitrification. That's this component here. As the water fills up more and more and more, we see more and more denitrification. Now, sooner or later, the reality is we're going to run out of nitrate. But this component of the nitrogen cycle is controlled by the oxygen content. This part has nothing to do with this has to do with food. This has to do with getting the energy to get the food. These are aerobic organisms. They're taking the material and they're decomposing it for energy and nutrients. These guys, they need something to respire. They need energy. They need respiration. And so they're going with anaerobic respiration because there's no water, there's no oxygen anymore. Does that make sense? Okay, questions? We feel good about this? All right, let's talk about the last component of this cycle. And that's the component of this N2 gas basically into nitrogen fixation. Okay? And it's really, in essence, a two-stage event. First is I need to have the fixation, and then the plants will uptake it. Okay? And what we're seeing here is we're basically converting that N2 into an ammonia, which is then converted into the amine right here. Now, what I have here, you've seen this part of it. This graph right here basically represents growth period along here and nitrogen uptake. Okay? And what you're looking at is you're looking at different times, different phases of the plant's growth. And we're looking at basically three different plants. We're looking at wheat, we're looking at corn, and we're looking at soybeans. Okay? Wheat and corn do not have symbiotic relationships. Okay? They get their nitrogen from the soil or from fertilizer. Okay? Soybean, on the other hand, does in fact have symbiotic relationships. It has a nitrogen-fixing organism associated with it, which can fix the nitrogen. Okay? And what you're seeing here is basically the growth period, and you're looking at nitrogen uptake. Now think about it this way, and this is not actually what this slide is trying to express, but I want you to think about it this way. If I start putting crops in the ground, the first crop that's there is going to get the nitrogen, whatever nitrogen's available. Does that make sense? Okay? So we're going to see a response curve, very similar in all of these guys. Wheat is going to get that nitrogen. Okay? Around this time in May, we start planting corn. Corn is going to get some of that nitrogen. Okay? By the time we get out here, unless we're fertilizing, there is no nitrogen left, because these guys have basically taken it up. Now, for most agricultural operations, you're not mixing these guys up, and you're not seeing a sequence like this. But just imagine that this is the scenario. I've got one field, and I'm planting all of these things. By the time it gets to the soybeans, there's not going to be a lot of nitrogen left in the field. So why is this soybean performing? It's got nitrogen fixation. Now, if the soybean was up here, would the soybean be using nitrogen fixation? Well, the microbial population, there's nitrogen there. It doesn't make sense for them to do it. But by the time you get here in this cropping cycle, the nitrogen's being used up. The soybean, the symbiotic, the microbial population that's doing the N fixation now has a serious advantage over other plants, and so it can fix the nitrogen and the plant can survive. Does that make sense? It's a very, I mean, that's not what they're trying to say here, but I want you to sort of think of it that way. Go.
So is that relating back to the other chart which has the different ranges of nitrogen fixation?
Oh, so that first when we're looking at just N fixation and free living and rhizobium and yeah, this basically relates to that. Except these guys, there's no nitrogen fixation with them. This guy has, and that's that range that's associated with that nitrogen fixation for soybeans.
So it might be really low for fixation because there's already nitrogen in the soil.
If there's nitrogen there, the fixation rates are going to be really, really low. Go.
Question, so is that cumulative nitrogen uptake over the season?
This is accumulation above ground. This is the average rate of nitrogen accumulation above ground. So this is the nitrogen uptake per kilograms per hectare in wheat, in corn, and in soybeans.
The average rate, like the nitrogen uptake per month then?
Well, this would be for this wheat plant right here, we're looking at, what's going on here is what you're looking at, I'm using this very differently. This is basically crops with, soybeans is actually in this whole thing. Okay, and this is soybeans with wheat, this is soybeans with corn, this is soybeans by itself. Okay, and what you're looking at is you're looking at the plant responses with soybeans. So in this case, wheat is actually taking advantage of the nitrogen that's being fixed by the soybeans. Okay, that's not the story that I was trying to show, but that's what this slide is actually telling you. Okay, so we're looking at these responses with other plants. And we're looking at the total nitrogen uptake. So this is wheat with or without soybeans. This is corn with soybeans. This is soybeans by itself. Go.
I'm confused. You can't have wheat with soybeans. So do you mean like soybeans harvested, then you plant
Yeah.
wheat? Okay. That makes sense.
This is a crop rotation. I mean, you don't plant any of the, well, you wouldn't plant this in one field. But I'm just, if you think about it from a conceptual sense, and if I'm planting my wheat in here,
So
it's going to harvest that nitrogen first.
the soybeans were the crop before the wheat.
Right. Does that make sense? I mean, I'm using it very differently than what it's being used. Okay, questions? Which brings us back to this slide. Now, does this slide make sense? Okay, we got nitrogen fixation into the plants. Now, theoretically, we also could be adding fertilizer. Okay, that nitrogen goes into the soil. Now, if we're adding fertilizer, we're adding it as a nitrate or an ammonium, okay, or ammonium and a nitrate. The plants can take that up. Okay, with nitrogen fixation, the plants are taking it up. In both cases, we're going to see biomass accumulation. This biomass is sooner or later going to die and go into the organic matter pool in the soil, where it's now going to be harvested. Now, theoretically, this does not necessarily have to be a straight line. I mean, it could go into an animal and then be dropped. I mean, if you're eating the material. Or it could be leaf fall or something like that, but it's going to get into this pool. The nitrogen is going to be an amino form, that N2 form. Okay? And this then becomes a food stock. The food stock, this is an organic form. We're going to see mineralization into ammonium, and that part of mineralization is called ammonification. The continuation of that mineralization is going to turn it into nitrification. It's basically going to be nitrate. So this whole sequence from here to here is mineralization. It has two steps. One is the ammonification step, and one is the nitrification step. Biologically mediated. These forms can be taken up by the plant. They also can be in the biomass of the organisms. Those organisms that are doing the decomposition ultimately can die, and we start the cycle again, or this part of the cycle again. Ammonium, because of its positive charge, can also be fixed in the cation exchange sites, which can then be later released. This nitrate, in anaerobic situations, can go through denitrification, turned into the N2 gas, which then in turn can go right back into nitrogen fixation. pools and fluxes, and the control thereof. We basically answered all three of those questions. Do we feel comfortable with that? Questions about it? Go.
How many different forms of nitrogen can plants take up?
Basically the two forms, ammonium, this one, and the nitrate. Those are the two forms that plants can take up. We, as biological organisms, can't. We need to bring it in this way. It needs to already be in that form. We, as different trophic level than plants. Plants are biological organisms too. Okay? All right. Now, that brings us to questions about the cycle itself and fertility. Okay? When you talk about a cycle often implies that it's completely closed. Okay? There's not going to be any losses to the system. The reality is that the nitrogen cycle isn't truly a cycle in a dafic sense, it's a cycle in a global sense. Okay? There are leaks in this cycle locally. I have leaching, I have harvesting, I have erosion. Those are leaks, and every one of those leaks are going to take the nitrogen out of the cycle. So it's not truly a cycle in a local sense, but it is a cycle in a global sense. Okay? I can have erosion, which takes that nitrogen away. I can have harvesting, which takes the biomass. I can have leaching, which basically takes the nitrates out. I can have denitrification, which takes that nitrate and converts it to N2 gas, which then could be gassed out of the system. We can also have potentially a burning event. If I have a burning event, I'm basically going to be burning up all of this stuff and this stuff, which basically means it's going to volatilize out of the system. So it's another leak. Okay? And these leaks, when we think about it from a management sense, the only tools that we have are basically increasing nitrogen fertilization or increasing biological fixation. Now, we do in fact have some other controls. We can minimize leaching. We can minimize harvesting or sort of maximizing a harvest but remaining all the residual behind. We can reduce erosion. So there are some other controls, but when it talks about actually getting nitrogen into the system, these are the only two things that we can do. We can add fertilizer in some form, whether it's an organic form or an inorganic form, or we can increase biological nitrogen fixation. It's the only ways we can get nitrogen into the cycle. We can reduce the loss of it, but those are our only tools to bring it into the system. Now, if we start talking about soil erosion, basically this is a map showing Africa to Asia. The brighter the color, more erosion is occurring. Okay? Now, if you look at where these brighter colors are, in a sense, we're looking at more agriculturally centric areas, sort of India, Malaysia, and China. Lots and lots of agriculture in there. But we're also looking at some climatic effects here. Okay? If we did this at the Dust Bowl prior in the United States, back in the 20s and 30s, we would have something that looked like this as well. Other potential losses is harvesting. Okay? Now, this is, the white part is basically the residual, the black part is basically the material that we actually harvest. Okay? And if you look at this, you can look at the different types of crops and the different responses from harvesting versus what's being left behind. So in theory, anything that's white can be left behind and be added back as organic matter, soil organic matter, back into the system. And as soil organic matter, it's got the amine groups attached to the organic material. So the nitrogen isn't leaving the system. So anything that you can do to bring this component down and concentrate your harvest on just the things that you need will increase, or reduce, I should say, reduce the nitrogen loss from that system. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay, if I start taking corn stubble away and things like that, potentially I'm taking that nitrogen away. Now, theoretically, I could be feeding that corn stubble to my cows and then bringing the manure back onto the field. In a sense, I can sort of keep this, increase this, or corn, increase this by still harvesting in this pattern, but then bringing that material back to the farm. Okay? That would be, in a sense, organic matter fertilization. Okay? But it's based on what's going on here, harvest-wise. So where are these leaches? We talked about this when we did the cycle, but basically we're looking at the gases, the ammonium gas, the nitrate and nitrite, or nitrite and nitrate, as well as the N2 gas from denitrification. Those are your leaks that are in the cycle. Okay? So, how do we feel about this? We're right back to that very complex cycle. But in a sense, we've talked about everything that's here. So let's walk through this cycle one more time. Here's our plant tissue. Biomass, whether that biomass gets into the soil through harvesting and eating, that biomass is going to get to the soil. This material is then going to be synthesized by microbial populations, soil organic material, and we're going to basically see ammonification or mineralization. Ammonia is basically going to be going through nitrite and nitrate. Okay? This can be lost through the system through gas, but this also can be taken up by the plant. This can be lost from the system as leaching, but it also can be taken up by the plant. Okay? This we can augment, and this we can augment through fertilizer, modifying this cycle, reducing the leaks or increasing the nitrogen in that localized cycle. Do we feel comfortable with this? All right? All right, guys, be free.